aircraft, and there's like no torque in the manual.
Oh, yeah.
So I had no idea what the torque was until I had to find that.
Okay, this chart is table 7-1 out of which book? AC 43131B. I almost said 1A. I'm just that old. Acceptable methods, practices, and techniques. This is what we call a standard torque chart. And read the top. From oil-free cadmium-plated threads. What is cadmium? That's that stuff that Easter eggs are made out of that you get. The cadmium, yes, that's exactly what that is. So you can eat them. Go ahead. All right. So oil-free cadmium-plated threads. This is not for specific stuff. So when you torque something, this is not your go-to chart. First, you go to the manual and you see what they say. If they say torque it and they don't give you any torques anywhere, well, they do. Let's be honest. So if I go to my Cessna manual and if it wants a specific torque, it's going to give me a specific torque. If it doesn't, just says torque it, trust me, my Cessna manual, my airplane's new enough, most airplanes are new enough, that it has a section in there that says like not specific torques. And it looks just like this. And it may even have the same numbers. Now, if I'm working on almost any one of these planes up on the wall here, I know we have some old, I think, Stinsons. There's Stearman's back there. I've got, Staggerwing Beach. That's a cool plane. So any of these really old antique planes, take that little yellow one right there. That's a Aranca Chief. The maintenance manual for that Aranca Chief, this is twice as thick. All right, and it's about that thick. Yeah. So it doesn't have a lot of information. That's where this type of stuff comes in, right? When your maintenance manual is silent, then you do this. Most modern maintenance manuals are incredibly thick, even for little airplanes. So this is not where you start. This is kind of the last ditch go-to. All right, so you would be making a huge mistake if you were building an engine and use this chart for anything. Because when you get into engines, this is for what kind of condition? Oil-free cad-plated threads. When you add oil or lack of oil, because it will cause a loss of 40% of your torque of what you want. So engines are wet torque. Failure to use wet torque on an engine is almost a guaranteed failure. So it's very important. And I'll tell you right now, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when the engineers figured out how tight they want something to be, like you'll find out, so cylinders are bolted onto the engine case. When they figure out how tight that cylinder, those nuts should be, they could care less. They could not care less. Yes, they could. They couldn't care less. Couldn't care less how much you are twisting something. That means nothing to anybody. That's because torque is how much you twist it. That is not at all what the end goal is. The end goal is bolt pre-stretch, preload. It's how much you stretch that bolt. And so the engineers figured out if I have a 1032 bolt here and I twist it at a rate of about 20 to 25 inch-pounds, then it is going to put a certain amount of tension on here. Notice they even give you this right here, 40,000 PSI. All right, so you're trying to get, I believe that's exactly what you're trying to do. We're trying to get 40,000 PSI to that, 24,000 PSI, here's 90,000 and 54,000. So you're trying to get this preload stress on the bolt. That's what it's all about. In a perfect world, I'm sure an engineer would throw out all of the torque charts and they would go to a stretch. And so every time you tighten a bolt, they would, instead of giving you a twist, which means nothing, they would give you a stretch. And you'd have to use a micrometer and you'd have to see how far you stretch the bolt. Higher end engines, nice engines, Lycoming does this, they actually do use stretch bolts on their connecting rods. Both ends of the bolt are highly machined and they give you a stretch and you do tighten them to a micrometer setting. Now what happens, like especially with cylinders, if you don't have the proper tension, the preload, what happens is every time the engine fires, it puts that stress and it tries to rip the cylinder off the case. And if you don't have enough preload on it, if there's not more tension in the bolt than there is the cylinder trying to leave, then it stretches the bolt a little bit every time. little bit. It just keeps stretching it, and then all the metal fatigues, and the nut and the stud just fall off into the cowling. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people out in the industry come up to me, hey, got a problem with my engine. Which problem? It keeps having the nuts and the studs break off, and then I got to replace it. What happened? They weren't stretched far enough because the mechanic who did it, put it together, didn't torque it right. It's an engine. It needed a wet torque. They went dry torque. Dry torque is 40% less than what it should be, roughly. So they missed the torque by nearly almost half. And so now the engine is slowly coming apart. And what they're seeing is the outside evidence. They're missing the inside evidence, which is a whole other lecture. So torquing is actually, it's important. It's easy. It's easy to do right. It's also easy to do wrong. Yeah.
So how long, per se, do you think it would take for an engine that was put together with dry torque for it to start falling apart? Like, would it be like
100 hours.
Oh, okay.
That's my guess, about 100 hours. I've never done one wrong, so I don't know.
So this dry and wet torque, is that going to be covered in the other classes?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, next, you're going to hear me wet torque. I'll never shut up about it.
And it's also in the manual, right?
Oh, yeah, it's in the manual.
Where it tells
But
you.
people don't read the manual.
Oh, okay.
No, they don't read that page. I'm like, oh, yeah, nah. Pretty bad. All right, let me see. Where did I leave off here? So length, that we got. All right, so I was kind of talking about thread pitch. So standard aircraft hardware. It's standard. Not all aircraft hardware, but standard. So your AN bolts is fine thread. How you doing, thread? You be fine. All right. So thread pitch, which is the same as threads per inch as thread pitch. Thread pitch comes in, we're just going to keep it simple. It's actually more complicated than this, but fine, which I just said most aircraft hardware is, which is also called NF, stands for National Fine, or Coarse, which is NC, which stands for National Course. There's also National UNF, Uniform National Course. There's a couple more. I forget what they are off the top of my head. And thread pitch is measured with what? Thread pitch is measured with a thread pitch
It's very interesting.
gauge. Thread pitch gauge. It is critical to note that the wrench size is not the bolt size. I probably haven't mentioned that yet. All right. So you should, and I'm going to expect you on the test to know, if I tell you I have an AN 4-8, that was really bad of me. I expect you on the test if I ask what size the AN 4-8 is, you should tell me that. That you need a new teacher. Somebody knows that. So a 4-5, there we go, that exists. Is what size bolt? Quarter inch by 5/8 inch long. Okay. Let's talk about some nuts. So that's all you need to know about bolts for this class. We'll get into more bolts when we get into Aero 300. We go through a whole series on hardware, but really we're going to circle back around. We hit this again, then we go much deeper. Next class, you're going to be working on Lycoming engines. Lycoming uses mostly coarse thread.
Playing with a laser pointer.
You are? Oh. Yeah, he's actually trained to chase a laser. So that's making him nuts.
It's Do you know how many times I've had to pull him back?
Yeah, he's like
In fact, it was funny because a second ago I was wondering, how come he never noticed that?
Yeah, no, he noticed.
Sorry.
Well, now he notices it. Oh,
Okay,
the desk
turn
is
around.
moving.
Wait, I gotta get out of here. All right. After poor guy. All right.
I'm just gonna have him face the other way.
No, okay. That's my fault. I'm sorry, Zeus. All right. Okay. Nuts.
I would love to see him do what he does with Dot here.
No. Okay. Yeah, I got one of those laser. We have an infrared thermometer with laser dots on it, and I shot it from the tool room into the lecture, like last year, or the lab when she was like standing there, and he took off with her, and she was not happy with me. So, all right, nuts. Sizing. So I just want to tell you that I'll make this a much more simplistic. The size of the nut corresponds to the bolt size. So an AN 4 dash something is what? Size? Okay, it's a 1/4 inch bolt. And it uses a 1/4 inch nut. Of course, that part's number is going to be different. It's, of course, to be an AN 365-428. You don't need to know that, but you can see the 4 in there. 365. I'll just tell you that. So, what kind of nuts do we have? All right, so let me see. We have, yeah, let's go through them. So we'll do this. Nut types. I'm off my note, my thing here. So we have plain nut. Let me see. It's plain, P-L-A-I-N, not P-L-A-N-E. Plain nut. We have both the, well, I don't want you to get caught up on numbers, so I'm going to write some, but don't freak out. You don't have to remember these. AN315, which is the thick. So if it's a thick nut, that means it's tension. And the 316, which is thin, which means it's shear. Let me see if I have some pictures here. Oh, tab. All right, so what kind of nut is it? Okay, because they can't see. Okay, castellated. So there's castellated, there's the thick and thin. Now I want you to notice how the cotter pin goes in. This is the correct way to put a cotter pin in. This is an optional. You don't use the optional unless you really have to. This is the appropriate way to put in a cotter pin. So if you're putting cotter pins in engines, this is self-locking nut. Now the way they work, this little green thing in here is nylon. And notice how it has no threads in it. And so what happens is when you're putting it on a bolt, when you're putting on a bolt, the threads of the bolt have to cut into this, and you can't put it on with your fingers. It's really hard to get on. If you can put it on with your fingers, it usually means it's been reused too many times and it's bad.
I think you're not allowed to reuse it though.
What's that?
I thought you're not allowed to reuse it though.
Well, that's a whole other lecture. You can reuse them as long as they meet the minimum prevailing torque. However, the minimum prevailing torque is not published for small nuts. So. Let's see, there's our plain nut. So we have AN315, we have the thick and the thin. So if it's thick, it's going to be what type of load? Tension. If it's thin, it's going to be shear. And the torque is going to be higher for which one? Tension. Okay. So we have, let's see. So we have the tension, we have the self-locking, and we have the castellated. There we go. We can just go with those right there. So plain nut. Plain nut. Castle. Yeah, I was going to say castellated. C-S-T-A-A-T. I was worried I was going to spell it wrong, which I think I just did. What?
Go just a little bit,
Go up a little bit?
down a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, I can't keep the whole class held up because you weren't in here.
He asked to, so.
Okay. All right, and we have the self-locking. And there's a lot more to this, right? There's high temp self-locking, which is really not high temp. There's, let me see, I don't think, let me get into that a little bit. I should stick with my notes. Otherwise I'm going to skip something. So plain nuts. We'll go back to this, plain nuts. So plain nuts, always use a lock washer. Always use a lock washer. Always use a lock washer. And if you're going to use a lock washer, you also have to use a plain nut to make sure that the lock washer doesn't dig into the aluminum.
Or a plain washer.
Thank you. Let me go to what I want to talk about. There we go. Well, that didn't work. All right, so here's my lock washers. There's several different types in aviation. We have the internal teeth, the external teeth, and the split lock. These are not reusable. This is reusable as long as it maintains its spring. So you can see how it is. So I said you put a bolt, then you put a flat washer because you don't want that bolt head turning into our part, right? Down the bottom, I got a flat washer and then the lock washer because I don't want that lock washer digging into my part, do I? No, I don't. And then the plain nut. So that's the way it's going to go.
And always make sure your plain washer is larger than your lock washer.
All right, we'll make sure it's the right size. So always use a lock washer. Yeah, and we have the other types. Let's see, plain nut. All right, so now let's go this way and talk about self-locking nuts. All right, they are never used or not used where a loose nut, bolt, or washer could get ingested into the engine. So in other words, a self-locking nut, the ones with this nylon insert, you trust them, but not all the way, right? So what they're saying is, hey, we like them, use them, but don't use it anywhere around an engine inlet where if one of these did somehow manage to vibrate free or come loose, it would get sucked into the engine. Now, how often do I see these get loose and no, they don't, especially if they're torqued correctly. But you can't use them there.
Got a question.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, I was told a long time ago, you can't use the fiber or the nylon style in the engine compartment at all.
Ooh, nice
Simply
segue.
because of the heat.
Nice segue. Thank you. Well, give me two points. 2. Not used on parts subject to rotation. Subject to rotation. That means a part that is rotating against another part, or the part itself is rotating. And that rotation is actually against the nut. You cannot have a self-locking nut because the thing that's rotating could actually grab the nut and start to loosen it up. Right? So you can't use it on any part subject to rotation. Now, that's not to say, like if you had a flange that's going around and a propeller that's bolted to it, they're both going around, right? But the nut is not subject to the rotational. I don't know if you understand that. I don't have a nice picture for that one. Let me see what I have. And they are considered low temperature. So they must be used in low temp environments. Why? Because it uses a nylon, uses a fiber nylon insert that, scroll just a little bit, that basically grabs the bolt. Grabs the bolt. And prevents it from turning. Can you reuse it? This is kind of a, I'm just gonna throw it out there, and I'm gonna tell you what I know, and you're gonna have to use reusable. Reusable if the nut meets minimum application torque. I'll talk more about this in Aero 300, but if the nut goes on real easy, then it's not grabbing anything, right? So there's this chart that is in AC 4313 that tells you exactly how much torque it takes in order to determine it's good. But this chart is only good for the very large size nuts. There's nothing for like a 1/4 inch, a 3/16, a 5/16. I don't even think there's one for 3/8, right? It just starts at something after that. So, and it says nothing. It just says, well, you can reuse it as long as it meets this torque chart. But the torque chart has nothing to do with the small nuts. So what does that mean for the small nuts? Can't reuse them. What did everybody do in the field? I think there might even be something like a Q&A question. Don't quote me on this one, I'm not sure. That says something about you can't reuse it if you can put it on with your hands. Or there might have been at one point. It was kind of the industry norm, if you will. Is that a dangerous thing? Yeah. That you can reuse them as long as you couldn't put them on with your fingers. Doesn't really sound very FAA-like, does it? Because one person's fingers may not be quite as strong as another's. So maybe you'd want me to work on your airplane. I'd be a little bit cheaper than Hannah because my fingers are stronger. I can reuse a nut or two more than she could. It's like, so hey, I saved $3 because Kevin has strong fingers. So I'm just going to tell you that's the rule. That's what it is. So can you reuse them? If it meets the minimum application torque. What do people usually do out in the field? If you can put them on, that's a norm though, isn't it? All right. They're low temp. Let's go 1, 2. And that torque chart is in AC 4313. We're not going to do that. 3, you must have one full thread, I'll say, of the bolt past the nylon.
Just one?
A minimum of one. Must have at least one full thread of the bolt past the nylon. That's to ensure that you have positive engagement. Otherwise, you have somebody out there, well, it's flush, but if you have at least one thread outside the nylon, you have enough on there.
Yeah, it's like just like visual confirmation that it's complete.
Yep. Okay, not for use in areas that exceed 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Why? It'll melt. So I've seen that happen in engine compartments. People put stuff too close to a heat source and the nylon just melts right out and you're going, hey, that's just a regular nut with something weird. Yeah.
Where do they get used the most?
Everywhere. They are everywhere. Okay, so Rich said he heard that they weren't supposed to be used in anywhere near the engine. I kind of I've never seen the rule, but it's my personal rule that unless a parts book from the aircraft tells me to use one forward to the firewall, I just don't. I use what's kind of called a high temp. I use the finger quotes because it's really not a high temp. So the next size up is a type of nut. Let me see if I have a picture of one. Like I said, it's more of an Aero 300 class when we start getting into too much of this stuff. There. So these are actually my Aero 300. This is the quasi high temp, and they take out the fiber insert and they cut holes in here and they pinch it in. So when you run the bolt through, it actually has to spread the nut out. But these cannot be used above 450 degrees because anything over 450 degrees, the cadmium in it bakes into the base metal and becomes super brittle. So I've seen people use these not on accident. I've seen them used to hold exhaust stacks on when they shouldn't have been. And I'll see it and I'll go to actually take them off with the socket and it disintegrates in my socket. Just little pieces fall out. And I'm like, oh, that's one way to get it off. Yep. All right, so these are our self-locking nuts. I've seen this dark green. I've seen it yellow. I've seen it red. I've seen it clear.
Yeah, clear.
Never.
No, white. They got the white.
If it's clear or white, guess where you bought it? Hardware
I mean, no,
store.
like, I've seen them, but as
Yeah,
far as like
hardware
anything
stores-
goes, no, I can't say.
Hardware store is white or clear. I've never seen that written anywhere. It's just an experience that I have. So this is the thick one, which means that is it what kind of load? Could I use it for a shear load?
Yes.
Sure you could. It's just a little heavier. All right. And this is for shear loads. Can it be used for tension? Never. All right. Because it'll just rip apart. There's only a couple threads. Look at that. 1, 2, 3 threads. That's all you get right there. Look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 29.
Double up. I think that would work.
Yeah, double them up. That was a good idea. Okay, where am I at here? Then there's the high temp. Let's see, high temp. High temp. I'm just gonna high temp self lock. I'm just gonna throw them there. Do not exceed. That was 450 degrees. I don't think you need to know that in this class. All right, then we'll get into castellated nuts. Castellated nuts. Castellated nuts. Designed to be used with a bolt or stud. Bolt or stud. A stud is basically a bolt without a head on it, and you turn the stud into a part. So let me see here. So if I had a block of aluminum, oops, that's kind of stupid. Block of aluminum, and we've got a hole drilled in it, and then I've got threads here. And so I take a stud and I say, okay, well, I'm take a stud and I screw it in here. So a stud is just going to be a piece of metal that looks like a bolt with no head. So there's going to be threads here, and there's going to be threads here. And so engines have a lot of these things on them. So it just looks like that. And so then I can take another part, and I can bolt this part on. And then the nut goes on top of that. Nuts are what? Green? Green, so there we go. So then the nut goes on like that, right? But if it's a castellated nut, we've got to have a hole there. And then this kind of comes up like that. And this kind of comes up like that. There we go. Good enough. And so now I got a castellated nut. And if I put a cotter pin in there, should I use a cotter pin?
Castellated.
Yeah, it's castellated. Do I need a cotter pin?
Yes.
Okay, so I put a cotter pin in there. So I put my cotter pin in, and I got to bend it over. I can't really do that, but I got a cotter pin. Well, guess what's going to happen? Your nut, your cotter pin, and this entire stud, you just made a bolt. So what's safetying this together? Nothing. So I could take a wrench, I could put it on my green nut right here and take the whole assembly apart, cotter pin, castellated nut, stud and all, right?
Yes.
So did I safety anything? I just made a bolt, is all I made. I made an unsafetied bolt. Can everybody see that? It's really important that you see it. So I can't put a cotter pin through that hole. What do I have to use for that hole right there?
Safety wire.
Safety wire. You guys are catching on. Smart group here. All right, with the bolt stud. Let me see. I'll just put use cotter pin for safety wire. Safety wire if used on a stud. And let's see, used on parts subject to rotation.
So if you're taking a stud out, is the only way to really get it out like a jam nut?
Okay, so to get studs out, one of the ways, especially automotive, is you take two nuts, put them together, and jam them together, which actually kind of puts a lot of stress between the threads, and that makes a tool you can get out. We don't do that in aviation. We use a stud extractor, which is a collet that goes over it, and it squeezes together like this, and then tightens up that way, so it doesn't create a shear spot in the stud. So, yeah.
What's that, your second one? Used cotter pin. Or
Used on parts subject to rotation.
Yeah.
Use cotter pin. Oops, it didn't. Sorry, my paper got down here and I was
Yeah.
messed up my thing. Use cotter pin or safety wire or safety wire is used on a stud. There we go.
Why would you use a stud instead of just placing the two parts next to each other and putting a bolt through both of them?
Okay, well, let's just say this red part here is an engine case. And so down in here is where the crankshaft and all that stuff is. So you can't get to the back side of this to tighten it.
Oh, okay.
So I could have just said that. In any application where you can't get into the backside to tighten. So, I don't know, every engine, even my little engine, probably has, I don't know, 50 of these things sticking out.
Nice. Oh, thank you.
All right, let's take a look at this here. All right, so what are some of the things we talked about here so far? All right, why is there a castellated nut with a cotter pin there?
Because it moves.
Subject to rotation. This is a little fork here, and this is some type of arm that comes out, and that's a push-pull, so it's going to be going back and forth. So subject to rotation, so you must use a, what kind of load is that, tension or shear?
Shear.
Oh man, you guys are awesome. Shear, all right. We're going to talk about safety wire a bit later, but for now, we have the self-locking nuts. Are these tension or shear nuts? They are tension because they are the tall ones. We have the plane nut. If you use a plane nut, how do you safety a plane nut? Lock washer is one way you can do it. Another way is a jam nut or a pal nut, but say lock washer. Also, pay attention to your nuts. Notice this, I don't know if you can see this. It looks like there's a washer that's kind of grounded,
Yeah.
made into this, and on this side there is no washer. Okay, this is the part that goes down. So don't put your knots on upside down. It's embarrassing. Oh, you can even see it right here just a little bit. People do it all the time. Like that's just bad. All right. Are these reusable? No. Is this one reusable?
Yes.
If you're going to use this, what must you use between this? Regular washer. And if you don't, what happens? I lose my crap. All right. Hey, we talked about this. Max temp for these. It says right there. Don't look. 250. Tension or shear? It says it on the bottom. All right. High temp, but it only works up to 450. Then after that, there's real high temp ones. Okay. Let me think. Castellated nuts. Don't forget I told you how you're going to torque it. Torque it to the lowest possible one, see if it lines up, and then you can go up to the highest and get the cotter pin hole lined up. Shear load, castellated. Look, there's only like 3 threads in that little thing. Yeah.
How do you get that thing over?
Oh, you just bend it.
Oh, just with your finger?
Yeah,
or
I mean,
with
you
like-
can
Tools.
bend it with
Oh, okay.
fingers.
No, you can't. Well, really small ones. Then we're going to start talking about torquing here a little bit. Torquing. We're going to talk about torquing. What else we got? All right. Yeah.
Maybe later in the course, but a lot of times we deal with nuts that have the safety wire holes in them also for locking.
Nuts with safety wire holes?
Yeah. With a little right through the diagonal in the corner. After we torque them, we lock them with safety wire.
Oh, okay.
We do that once in a while.
I haven't really seen one of those.
Yeah.
Okay, so I still have more to cover, so that means that we will have the test on Monday. So you're going to come in on Monday. I'll remind you tomorrow, but otherwise we'll have a regular day tomorrow. No test tomorrow.
What exactly is the test? Because we're covering everything that we were going over just.
The test will cover everything we talked about all week, which also means that I will extend the deadline for your for your.
What's the difference between the two tests? We had some instructions.
Hang on, guys. I got a lot of questions going on. If you're done and you want to leave, go that way so I can talk to the rest of the class.
What's like the difference between the instructor part and the normal part?
Okay, what is the difference between the instructor part and the